Good afternoon, good morning. I hope you had a nice Easter holiday. Just to remind you from the previous session, you spoke about justice, and you also mentioned the fact that the judicial system should not create injustice. So the idea of closing in a prison somehow also provides a stigma, so labels the offender. So a system, a child who enters into the judiciary system remains lifelong marked and labeled, and this certainly undermines his future prospects. We also notice that restorative justice identifies the cause of the problem, the consequences of the victim. So this allows to better tailor-make the punishment for both the offender and also the victim, so that both come out of the end of the judicial procedure with an appeased situation. And so Bruno van der Maat, the professor, is going to now focus more on the implementation of restorative justice. And at the last session, he provided a short reflection that you were asked to reflect upon during this week. And I give him the floor. Thank you very much, Marie-Laure. So good day to all of you. I don't know if it's morning or day for you. I will resume, as Marie-Laure was mentioning, what I had mentioned at my last meeting, that is, what we have discussed last week could have been implemented in your countries. So at the beginning of last week, I also acknowledged the fact that the cultural and legal social situation varies between countries, which certainly does not allow to provide a silver bullet or a solution fits all. In order to properly analyze the situation, I would like to show you now a slide with the questions. So once again, you have the questions in 3 colors. English is in red, French in green, and Spanish in blue. It's simply, it's a survey. It's not by far an exam or anything else. That is, the question is the restorative juvenile justice system. What is the situation in your country? Now, you do have 5 possible answers. A means it already exists in my country. B, we do not, need, or we fail rather, a legal framework in our country. So in the absence of a law, it cannot be actually enforced. Or C, the system exists, but more resources are needed. So we do have a legal framework in theory, but there is no kind of resources. That is, we need specialized expert teams, resources, human resources, facilities. So it exists, but it's more of a formal existence. The 4th possible answer, which is D, letter D, that it is absolutely against public opinion. So mainstream public opinion. That is, for example, in our country, we do not have a restorative juvenile justice system, and it is very difficult to be implemented.
Les politiciens, les juges, etc. Tout le monde serait contre.
Everyone is against, because in our society, punishment is important, discipline is important. So we do not have this kind of restorative justice, and I even believe it is unlikely to be the case, to be actually implemented. And then we also have E, which is any other case, you know, for a number of additional reasons. So these are the 5 kind of answers. Either it exists, B, a lack of law, there is no legal framework. C, it exists, but there is a lack of resources. or resources are insufficient, and D is that simply it is quite unlikely to be implemented because it goes against public opinion, or E is actually outside completely of all these scenarios that I have depicted. So how are you asked to reply? Use the chat. Open up the chat and kindly click on a letter. Just put the letter in the chat. So simply put the letter, so A, B, C, D, E, and your country. For example, C and then Colombia, or A, Kyrgyzstan. So you don't need to indicate your name or anything else, but simply the letter and the country. So should it be E, the reply, the response, then maybe I would ask you if you could spell out the nature of the problems. I hope that I've been fairly clear in this explanation. So kindly try to reply in the chat by indicating the letter corresponding to your reply and the country, nothing more. We will try to see how can you implement a restorative justice system. So I have prepared a few slides. So as I was saying today, we're going to try to implement a restorative justice. Now, won't be able to provide any kind of a miracle solution because, as I said, frameworks and contexts are extremely varied and diversified. So probably we will have to mainly understand the feasibility of such systems. I would like to start with a definition, first of all, among the many possible definitions available. I'm sure that you have probably found other definitions. This one recompiles the various definitions. So when we speak about restorative practices, it can be defined as a process through which all people concerned by a problem that has occurred voluntarily come together to try to find a solution accepted by all. This again is a definition that is available in the 3 languages. So what would I like to underline? The word process. So the restorative practice is not the aim, the goal, but it is a process. And so any restorative practice aims at social peace. So justice is a means, not an end. In order to, as it is here specified, to try to find social and to reach social peace, social harmony. As I mentioned, it is a process. This is why all have to be involved. So with no exclusion, one cannot decide that if one is against or one is not in favor, it would not be feasible because otherwise the system is no longer credible. So everyone, every single person concerned has to be involved. Now, of course, we can say voluntarily. Now, of course, if you seize in crime and we say you're going to send you in prison, through a traditional legal system, or if you and you go into prison and you tell him why don't you accept this restorative justice? So he could say yes, or I would like to, I don't want to be confronted with the victim. Or he could also say, I don't believe in this system. We have to leave the option open. And the same is for the victim. Many victims do not want to join and do not want to participate because they are absolutely traumatized. They have no intention and no desire to be faced with the offender. And the victim can also say, no, I'm not going to accept, I won't be part of it because, and then in this case, it is not feasible. However, there are some alternative ways of reaching the solution, which does not necessarily place the two in a direct confrontation. Maybe this could be done through indirect mediation. The word voluntarily that you can find here for the world voluntarily is of great importance. The same is for the community. But one could say, why would the community be willing to take part to this kind of process between two neighbors? Well, because actually the community should be involved. As I said in the last week, if there is, for example, a theft in the neighbor's house, it's not a problem for the for the neighbor who's been and the burglar, because simply everyone is going to feel insecure. Maybe everyone might decide to buy a dog, a guard dog, or maybe an alarm system. So if you want to actually solve the problem in case of a burglary and have a meeting between the burglar and the neighbor, it will probably be the best solution. Why all together? Because all together have to reach a proper solution. I didn't really know how to say jointly solution. I said a solution accepted by all, but it's just like saying reaching a joint solution. So a joint solution is a solution which is agreed by all, so that at the end you can no longer say I disagree, because you have been part of the process and you've been part of the problem-solving process. So you reach the solution together. Maybe one has to try to change the mindset and the paradigm mindset, because the solution is not always the middle or the middle solution. Aristotle said, when one said, I could pay 50 and the other said 100, for Aristotle says it's in the middle, so it would be 75 actually. But this is if you have an exchange. And so when you speak about a restorative justice, one could say, I have only 50. While if the victim says, I want 100, the solution is certainly not to say, okay, let's I solve the problem by accepting or by setting 75, because 75 is too much for the offender, but it is too little for the victim. So in that case, you cannot choose a mathematical average or median, but you have to instead try to understand the interests of the stakeholders. So trying to basically find a common or a joint solution. So in a restorative practice, you don't have to reach the actual sum or the actual amount, but you have to solve the problem. So the goal, the aim is the solution of the problem. So it goes far beyond the idea of bargaining or agreeing on a certain amount of money. So you have to jointly reach an agreement and a solution. So this was just a possible definition. So it's a process. They all take part voluntarily together to try to reach a solution. What do we actually need to do in order to implement a restorative justice? Well, first of all, we need a legal framework. We need a law, a regulation. Otherwise, you cannot. And then you will need certainly resources. So we will also notice that a law with no resources is not sufficient, because if you have a law but you don't have resources, that will not be the solution. Thinking about adults, for example, if you have 100%, and they're often involved at 240%. So let's say that in prisons, instead of the total capacity would be 150, and there are now 240, which means that there are more than 1.5 prisoners. So this means that we need a solution, and certainly a solution could be the restorative justice, but you need to be in agreement. Now, I don't know if, of course, everyone is in agreement. Thinking about the reading, I don't know if you had a look at the reading, but I found this document excellent because it's a very good way of showing what should be done, but not only what should be done, but also the problems which might occur. I would like to mention, well, focus on two elements, law and resources. And then after the break, I will speak about the motivation. So how can we actually motivate to encourage resorting to restorative practices? Now, in order to do that, when we speak about the legal framework, so as I mentioned, I'm not going to actually provide the ideal law. There's no ideal legal framework, but I will try to provide some criteria. And this is why I will do that through 6 questions that you probably will have to try to answer in order to actually identify the proper legal framework. Now, the first question to be asked is, this law should be applicable to whom? In many countries, one starts with the young, and in other countries with adults. So we have to, first of all, answer to this first question. So if we want to actually have a proper restorative justice, who is the target public? It's a very important question, since this will imply sort of a philosophical research and analysis of the legal system, because according to which criteria one would choose the young more than an adult. Well, often the case is that young people haven't fully developed their potential, their psychological potential, their maturity, sense of responsibility. They're still evolving and maybe changing, while an adult normally is more settled and developed. Young people need to have a certain framework. They need educational resources and other forms of material resources. So let's say that young people are probably the best population for, or group of age for, restorative justice. However, we should also consider the following. If this kind of system can be enforced with young people, why couldn't we apply it also to adults? I spent quite some time in prisons with adults, and I also noticed that many adults reacted with a lack of maturity, with a lack of education, social citizenship. So their behavior was similar to that of the young. So why couldn't we apply this kind of system also to adults? I met a lot of in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who were reflecting and who had, let's say, fairly primary reactions. He was acting almost like, or behaving like a 15 or a teenager. So, of course, if you cannot actually impose a death penalty or capital punishment to an adult, why could we do this to a young? Or, I mean, so, for example, so life imprisonment also. Why couldn't we do that? If you do that for an adult, why couldn't you do that for a young person? So a law certainly cannot be a solution fits all. It does require a mindset, a complete change and shift of mindset. Let's say the United States have not ratified the Convention of Children's Rights. Now, of course, the fact that they have not ratified the convention means that you can impose life imprisonment to a child or to a minor is something which is not normally done. You normally try to avoid this kind of sentence. However, there are thousands of young in the United States who have been inflicted life imprisonment. They have been condemned. Besides the fact that they're minors, they are under 18 years of age and who are never going to leave prison because there's no way that they can have a revision of their sentence, of their decision. Now, this was the case in the past. It's no longer the case today. Today, life imprisonment for minors is forbidden. But of course, there are some judges who today believe that I can no longer use this kind of decision. But if they have committed a crime, for the first crime, I normally assign 40 years. For the second, I give 60 years. And for the third crime, 35. So a total is 135 years. It's not a life imprisonment, but he should spend 135 years in prison behind the bars. So you don't necessarily impose life imprisonment, but if you find a sort of bypass to the result is exactly the same. So who is the target age group? Is it going to be only for young, only for adults? Is it going to be for both? Second question. So what kind of crimes can be dealt with by restorative justice? Many normally believe that they speak about minor conflicts because they believe that you can, the minor offenses, you know, you maybe have stolen a PC or a cell phone, you broke the glass or a window. So it's when you speak about a minor offense or minor crime, so there is a restorative justice because it is possible somehow to repair that. So you don't cover, you know, rape, murders, and major offenses. So we also have to define for which kind of crimes, as I said, minor crimes, minor offenses. But once again, try to properly reflect, because we also have to consider that instead capital offenses, instead, like as I said, you know, rape, murder. What kind of response is the best? When we speak about reparation, it's not possible normally, because in case of a you know, a murder. But if you cannot, what do you do? Then what do you do with the offender? Are you going to send them 20 years behind the bars? What kind of sort of reparation is that going to be for society? So also in this case, probably there are forms of potential reparation, which can be a symbolic reparation to community, to the family of the victim. So also in this case, one should question oneself and believe that restorative justice should be limited only to minor offenses or to all offenses. Because if you start from the idea that this kind of justice is better, produces less consequences compared to punitive justice, then maybe it should be privileged. So now, when would you apply that? So during the proceedings, during the trial, when would you adopt or when would you introduce restorative justice? So when you're actually seized or caught by, you know, police, or when the judge is analyzing your file, or once when the decision is communicated. So we have to decide at which stage of the proceedings one would introduce and apply restorative justice. Just to give an example, in Peru, In juvenile justice, the prosecutor has the possibility of actually delivering this, which is he would simply, normally according to the legal clauses, he would say, I don't want to hand over the trial to the judge. So one would simply remit. Now, if you actually behave properly during 6 months, and if we have a confirmation that you want to really repair the what you have done, then we basically file your trial, and you're not going to be actually judged, and you will not pursue the trial. And also, of course, you will not have a criminal record either. However, even if the prosecutor does not decide to use this kind of solution, it is, let's say that the lawyer doesn't want to do that, and the prosecutor doesn't want to do that, but the judge could also decide to do that. He could postpone, he could remit the decision to a given delay, 6 months, a year, or whatever. And if the, let's say, the offender does not behave properly, there could be a proceeding, and he could either renew that term or actually pass on to the final decision. In certain countries, restorative justice intervenes at the end of the decision. So at the end of the condemnation, everything is done. You have the police procedures, the prosecutor, so the prosecution, then the judge, and the judge normally condemns to a given number of years of in prison or to this given restorative justice. And that is the moment when actually the person who has been the convicted can decide to use a different way of paying and serving his punishment. But there is a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of red tape, even in the legal system. But we also know that normally any sentence can produce a trauma. So that trauma should be avoided. Now, a third possibility is that there are many communities in certain countries. There are some ethnical groups, and each ethnic group has a sort of a way of solving these legal issues. Quite often, these are restorative processes, quite often. So do you limit the restorative justice and you hand it over to these groups, to these ethnic groups, or rather, you would adopt that restorative justice to the entire population? If you apply that to the entire population, that would avoid the problem that a member of the community living in the same village might commit a crime or an offense. So at that point, you have to understand what kind of justice would you apply: the official one, the national one, or the community one. So if each community or ethnical group has a special system, you cannot maybe limit yourself to the local one, because it's probably not necessarily a guarantee that the way of the proceeding is fair. I'm thinking about communities where the man is normally there. It's a sort of a society where men prevail. Often the women would be not only the victim, but she also doesn't have the same rights. But instead, we should say that every citizen is entitled to the same rights, so has the same right to follow the same procedure. And now this is the same situation that concerns the following question: exclusions. Now, if we adopt a restorative justice system, we should foresee waivers or exclusions of groups, of certain cases. Just let me do that with a very clear example. The Council of Europe in 2011 has published the Declaration of Istanbul, which has been ratified and signed in Istanbul. It is a declaration on violence in families against women. In this declaration, there is one element which is relevant to us today. That is, in the case of violence in a family or against a woman, the signatories countries, the countries which have ratified the convention, cannot use mediation to reach a solution. So in this case, actually mediation is not applicable. It is not enforceable. Because in this declaration, in a couple, even in Europe, times women are in a situation of inferiority. So they are more vulnerable compared to men. So should there be a violence against her, and she is the victim, and if you try to mediate between the two, it is fairly clear that the strength of the word of man, the strength of man will not take into account the role and what women believe and their opinion. So because women are inferior and they cannot be prevail. So the role of man is prevailing. And so in this declaration, one underlines that mediation is not enforceable and you have to find an alternative solution. So does this justify restorative justice? No, because there are alternative ways of reaching the solution. But we tend to exclude actually mediation between the two because there is a complete imbalance between the two, men and women, in this specific case. So should we exclude, for instance, the case of violence in families or violence against women or violence against minorities or vulnerable categories such as the disabled? Well, this certainly will have to be decided upon. Certainly what we can say is that just a few weeks ago, as you know, Turkey has withdrawn by the Istanbul Declaration, and it is quite unusual because the declaration was signed in Istanbul at the first place. So unfortunately, it's a contradiction. However, you can use either a formal justice legal system or an alternative. If you have read the manual, the handbook that I indicated in the bibliography, you probably noticed that the two cases both present advantages and disadvantages. Now, should the system of restorative justice be included among the formal ones, it does provide a certain authority because we are in the formal system of justice. But there is also a risk. That is, there could be some professionals, you know, the judges, the prosecutor, and others. So we would not exclude certain protagonists, the victim, the offender, and the community. So there are advantages and disadvantages. Should there be a parallel system? So should this be a parallel system? There grants a certain independence, although it is always supervised and monitored by a judge, but we offset the risk. However, should this be a parallel system, is that the system is not considered as something sound enough, sufficiently serious. It would be considered almost like a second-class justice, insufficient, which cannot be acceptable. And I prefer to resort to a judge. Just to give you an example, in Peru, I'm sorry, but these are first-hand cases. In the case of a civil proceeding a couple of years ago, since there are a lot of issues which come into play, the judicial system was absolutely overwhelmed by the number of proceedings. And so in order trying to streamline and to limit the burden of the civil legal judiciary system, so before actually going to the court, it was actually a civil case, one certainly asks to go through a form of mediation or conciliation procedure. And this allows for a possible solution. So that is an attempt of conciliation. Now, the law has been voted, but what has happened now? This has been enforced now for 2 years now, that in quite a number of cases, the two parties consider this kind of conciliation a form of minor justice. So what do? Together, they speak to the conciliator. They say, how much does that cost? And they give him the money, and they say, no, we pay you, but we want to go to a court. We want to go to actual trial. So they pay the conciliator, but they don't want to accept his decision. So with this is a risk, because actually they would believe this is not actually a very serious justice. I'm not going to participate, or I accept this solution. I want to go for a more official form of justice. Now, I noticed that we have started about 40 minutes. I maybe would like to stop here before moving on to the second part, which is that affecting resources and motivation. Now, I would like to know, I wanted to go back to the idea of a minor offense in the case of restorative justice. So if we consider that the judge will have to pronounce maybe a punishment, but there's not going to be a proceeding, and the offender can also refuse the decision issuing from restorative justice. Maybe one does not accept this kind of commitment. Actually, there's a lot of background noise. When you speak about restorative justice, the judge can also provide a minor punishment for minor offense, which probably would not contribute. Sometimes you would consider only minor offenses for restorative justice. So if you limit restorative justice to minor offenses, the offender will be sentenced to a minor punishment, not to, for example, a 3-year sentence. And probably he will not repent. But this is exactly repentance. So this is actually the punitive justice, because it's not the judge who provides the sentence. It's the all together, the offender, the victim, and the community. So all together will reach the decision. So what you have said is actually a bit an exception. What in Peru, if a young person steals a phone, there is no consequence, because if it's like my phone, it's really not worthwhile, because you don't even reach a minimum amount to which justifies a conventional system, proceeding, because the amount of the crime or of the offense does not justify a trial. While in restorative justice, even if you steal a portable, and even if the portable has no value, there is a decision taken together with the victims. So the three are together, the community, the offender, and the victim are reach a joint decision. So it's not the judge who basically decides, it is not in an arbitrary way decides the punishment. So it doesn't impose a punishment, but only in conformity with the code. So the system is completely different in restorative justice. So I will analyze that in the second part. And how can you justify, how can you motivate that to reach this, or to adopt rather this system? Because one could actually wonder, there is no actual punishment, and you even enter into prison, but then it's absolutely useless. So you're trying to find a solution to the problem. You don't have to necessarily punish. You don't have to necessarily, send them. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank really for this part. I think he has really clarified the concept, and I would like to just say what my predecessor said. I don't find any kind of offense independently of the offense. I think that restorative justice is always applicable and enforceable. That is, there's always a second chance. So I think that at every stage of the procedure, one should resort to this kind of justice. If you actually provide reinsertion and reparation to the victim, I think it is a good solution. So, which does not necessarily imply that you should provide a formal setting or framework for restorative justice. So, for example, within the formal legal system, one could also enforce the restorative justice. I wanted to add this supplement of information. So what I'm thinking is that it doesn't matter if it is a formal or an informal system. However, restorative justice will always be useful, because it always will provide benefit to both the victim and the offender, and must not be used as a way of escaping justice. Thank you, Bruno, for the quality of your contribution. You mentioned 5 questions: who, when, what, and the other questions. Now, of course, I don't know if actually you can respond to all of these questions. When you say, for example, a number 5 question, should it be a parallel system or a legal system? I think it should be a system, a legal system, not a parallel system, because if it is not viewed as a legal system, the decisions will not be considered relevant, and otherwise you resort to formal justice, because one would say, no, I refuse the decision and I want to resort to the legal one. So if you actually want to imply and enforce restorative justice, it has to be the only one acceptable. Now, when you answer whom, I believe it should be applied to all the young, minors, adults. What? Second question, I believe it should concern crimes or offenses, but be aware of the fact that there is recidivism. So you have to take them into account. And also sexual abuses, who are very delicate, cases. And I believe that it can be sort of applied in any case, in the case of repetition of the same offense. But you can find maybe a solution. Of course, you also have, as regards the prosecution, you have, so I think the community should be at the core of this process. But in a community, you're going to also have different traditions. And of course, they will all want to enforce their traditions. And maybe if the victim and the offender do not belong to the same tribe or the same ethnical group, what are you going to do? Because the decision is not going to be easy. Thank you. Thank you very much, Moussa. It's a pleasure also to see you again. So just a few, these criteria, these 6 criteria do not necessarily follow an order of priority or of importance. I would rather say that there is no specific order. It is simply taking into account and consider the validity. Now, the actual problem of repetition or recidivism. Yes, repetition of a crime occurs because the legal punishment or legal system is not appropriate. And then also the issue concerning the community concerns a legal framework. You do need a legal framework if you actually want to implement that, but you have to do that at least on all those issues which are included in the criminal code. Now, if there are some cases which are not covered by the criminal code, this is part of the community. There are some social conventions which are not included. So actually, they believe that this could be done or not be done. And we have to maybe consider the situation in each country. Now, let's not forget the fact that the fact of having laws does not necessarily provide social progress. Because in many countries, people say that in a train or on a bus, there are some places which are reserved for the handicapped, for pregnant women, for elderly women. One would say, oh, wonderful, because this is a law. This law is not a proper law, because that means that you need to have a law to, because you need to say that the woman needs to be seated. We have completely lost our solidarity. But one could say, okay, I am tired, but this woman deserves far more than I do. So our system, our social cohesion, our culture has degraded to such an extent that we are unable to understand the needs of the other. We are all absolutely self-centered. I am sitting down and I'm not going to get up. Why should I get up? So we should maybe consider also the laws in the framework of social conventions. So what about community? Community, neighborhood, they could act all together, even if there is no actual law. Community could say, no, we don't accept that, this we accept, although this is not actually a problem for the judge or for the prosecutor. So once again, one should consider the actual conditions. An additional problem, when there are main differences between the victim and the offender, it is a problem because, of course, they all have their own system, So you need to have actually a legal framework to understand that what occurred is inappropriate, is actually an offense. It is an infringement of a norm, of a rule, and so it needs so you have to ask the offender, why did you do that? Why did you commit this? And the victim also should say, what did you feel? Because if they belong to 2 different cultures, probably the cause and the consequences, that is the themes that we have dealt with last week, are analyzed in a completely different way. So, of course, the offender probably had an idea, but this does not necessarily correspond to the ideas of the victim, and also the opposite is true. So as a victim, I should not, I don't understand why this has been done, but once he explains what he would like to do, and this maybe doesn't correspond to my way of believing, but I try to understand. I do not justify, but I try to understand. And of course, this kind of understanding, of mutual understanding, is impossible in a different system. And so the two, so this is actually a problem. This is a problem which should be raised. And also in the case of a sexual abuse, is there a possibility of having a restorative justice? Yes, but of course you do need to have a mediator, and it has to be a well-trained mediator in order to reach a solution or a settlement, because then the offender and the victim maybe do not want to meet. Case of an infringement or an act of violence, it is understandable. But if you condemn a raper to spend 30 years in prison, is that going to be a solution? Is he going to be psychologically supported? Is he going to be maybe treated in order to avoid, because otherwise what happens with the victim? Do we have a way of understanding how to compensate the victim? Should he maybe undergo a kind of therapy in order to understand and to overcome the problem? So once again, you have to actually analyze the situation and the solution in order to identify the best possible solution. What I clearly can understand is that in the case of punitive justice, sexual abuses are not seriously taken into account. And I find that the solution is not a proper solution, because the raper has been, is going to continue, and the victim will not be, so the rapist will not be properly treated, and the victim as well, and community included. So I don't think in this case, I believe that in these specific cases, restorative justice provides a more long-lasting solution compared to punitive justice. Thank you very much. Can I ask a final, oh, I have just one more comment that I would like to add. When you say, he's said something very important. That is something which is absolutely fundamental in the case of a restorative justice. Everyone can change. We are all liable to change. And if we do not believe in this principle, then restorative justice is useless. And then we fall back to punitive justice. So if we say he's a rapist, there's nothing he can do, or he's a robber, nothing can be done. So we actually impose a label and a stigma, and the person is considered someone who cannot change. So he deserves to be behind the bars. But if we start from the principle and that anyone can change, me too, I can change. It's difficult, but I can change. I know it's not easy, but if we start from the idea that we can all change, this is absolutely a fundamental principle. So no one is completely lost. This coming Sunday, we have elections and running elections. The candidates, which are about 18 candidates, when they were asked, what are you going to do for security in society? Most of them were believing that you had to imply a very, let's say, tough system, the iron fist. They believe that those who have committed a crime for the first time, but when you have a repetition, there is no pardon. They believe that the only solution is life imprisonment. No, you can maybe change even after having committed a first or a second or a third crime. So if there is a repetition, recidivism, it's not the fault of the person, but rather how you have treated the person, how we have done all in our means and possibilities to allow him to be aware of his act that he has committed, that he can be reintegrated in society. So I think it is correct. We should start from the basic and fundamental principle that we can all change. I didn't really mention countries, but more continents, I would say. In principle, in Africa, you have 50% believe that it's a system that exists, and the other half believe that there is no legal framework. So there are certainly differences between the many countries, and where it does exist, where it is, they lack resources for a proper enforcement. In Asia or Eastern Europe, you have the two possibilities, but they lack resources or it does not exist. And there is a common element, that is, it is difficult due to the mindset. I believe it's fairly, what is fairly common is repression, or oppression rather. And this is what happens in Latin America. So you could say that there is a system, but there are about 6 who affirm that, again, it's a question of mindset and mentality. So once again, if the system exists, if there is a legal setting and they lack resources, but also the fact that people do not necessarily agree, because many have a different mentality. They believe that you have to punish. Punishment is, it depends very much on the also cultural mentality. In Latin America, for example, often they're not really accustomed to democracies, but to military systems, so to an iron fist, and then also a fairly punitive formal legal system. So once again, this would require, changes. I would like to now share my screen again. So this is somehow very sort of an overview, but otherwise I invite you to maybe use the handbook of the UN, which is far more complete. Today we certainly do not have time for that. It's the handbook on restorative justice programs. Now, here we speak about resources. We have 2 different types of resources. One could say, infrastructure or facilities. Why do you need specific facilities? Yes, you do need them, actually. I want to give you an example linked to a personal experience, which dates back to 15 years ago in Peru. You can see on the left-hand side a police station. So what happened in the capital, in Lima, in Peru, you would basically, when he is caught in obvious offense, often at nighttime, he normally is brought to the police station, and he's often closed in a cell. Often he didn't have a free cell, so he would end up with adults, which is absolutely against the law, or same alone or with other minors. But you can imagine the condition of cells in your countries. I believe they're often without any natural light, with bars, maybe dirty, with murals. There is no toilet, smells. It's a very unpleasant place when you want to start somehow raising awareness in a minor. So the first pilot experience of restorative justice in Peru, they have gathered psychologists, and they said, how could we improve all of that, and look at the result. In the 3 images, you can see you have a toilet already. This is a positive thing. You have also a basin, a water basin, and a water tap, and a shower. So actually there are no bars. There is a grid, but the grid allows light. It's a fairly open grid, which is normal for all the windows in Peru. So it's a very common one. You don't have the feeling of being in a prison. You also have a little table you have a mattress where you can actually sleep, and also the mattress is not inflammable, because sometimes you can have some reaction when you are closed in a prison, you know, or in a cell. And it's also very light color. It's like a light blue, so it's anti-inflammable, and so it gives a completely different impression. A young person who is enclosed in this cell, even if he's in a police station, he feels completely I mean, let's say who is used to the cell of a police station, when he enters this kind of room, he has a completely different impression. And this kind of cell should be also for adults, absolutely. So we should invest in resources, but we should also invest in staff, in human resources. And the second line, you have a classical police guard. I think dating back to the 40s in Peru, he has white gloves. So he touches with the glove the child by the ear. This was a bit of a very conventional and traditional way. Then on the right-hand side, in the center photo, you have an educator, the offender, and the mother, which is completely different compared to a police station, dark place, smelly place, where there you have a nice light and table. So you have to invest in resources, also in human resources. Just to also show the image of mediators. Mediators are professionals. They are experts. They have a background in law, the local culture. They are also able how to address people and young ones in particular. So they have a psychological formation and training in psychology. They're familiar with the situation. They are familiar with the revenue, with the unemployment levels, social problems. They are actual specialists who try to act in the setting, but you cannot really form them in 2 weeks. You cannot do that with a little booklet, 20-page booklet, answers and questions. It does require an important investment, so you certainly need to have the possibility of training them. And you have to invest also in judges, because there is a form of supervision for judges which can be either the prosecutor or the judge. They need to be properly trained, but they also have to be convinced. They have to be seriously convinced that restorative justice is far more just and fair than compared to punitive justice. And they do need this change of mindset. So you have to invest in the resources and the legal setting. And you have to invest, because if you do have a legal framework, as mentioned by a few, but you often lack resources, you lack facilities, human resources. So we are at the third element, motivation. Now, how can we motivate population in order to actually move towards a restorative justice? The first element is not the most important to us, but I would say it's something which could encourage a change in mindset, not only of the public opinion, but also of managers and decision makers and politicians. If you could be able to actually prove that the system reaches the same results or even better than the current ones, and which is cheaper, it's economically viable, well, that will certainly convince a lot, because politicians and decision makers would be very happy to cut costs, because, prisons are often very expensive. Even if they do require, expenses, and even the reformatories are very expensive. So if you are able to convince and persuade that the system is economically viable, is cheaper, so it's more convenient, providing better results, less a repetition of crime, then that is an important argument. Now, how much is the cost of a place in a reformatory? And you should compare that to a place in this open system. I know that there is it's far more convenient because you don't need to build a new prison because you have fewer young in a prison. You have you need less staff, less the expenditure in food and lodging is also is limited because the young person remains in his family. So this money could be instead used for prevention and also to train staff. So we also know that $1, currency, whatever the currency is, each dollar, euro, or whatever spent invested in prevention normally means a saving of at least $5, euros, or other currency in punishment. So if prevention is effective, that leads to a saving. Second argument, motivation, is culture. So in a given culture where the word conciliation, mediation, conflict solution belongs to that culture, to that given culture, that is also a cultural argument and motivation. If you remember the example of the prison in Cameroon, where you had the pavilion of Kosovo, which absolutely did not correspond to the local cultural practice. So if you are able to convince public opinion by saying our punitive system has been imported, doesn't belong to us, it has been imposed upon us, and which certainly is not aligned and does not correspond to our values, while instead a restorative justice is far more aligned with our traditions, then we have a cultural argument to motivate a change in the system to be adopted. So the cultural aspect is very important. So you have the economic aspect, but also culture, and then community is just as important. Why would a community be important? Well, because there is certainly a profit for a community where you have robbery, where you have murders, where you have rapes. So if that given community, you say we could solve these problems, we could avoid, for example, the recurrence of these offenses in the longer term, it will mean a safer community. But unfortunately, in many communities, we do no longer have communities. We have a group of people who live together, but who don't know each other. I'm thinking about the big metropolitan areas where people live in certain, neighborhoods or blocks, but actually you don't even know your neighbor on the same floor. So what kind of community are we talking about? So you need to find different forms of communities, groups who maybe belong to the parish, to the mosque, cultural groups or other, an association, a neighborhood association or something. But the community could be motivated for this kind of justice. Fourth element is time. So do we sort of look backwards? So you close someone in a prison and forget about the problem? Or should we be instead more far-sighted and look ahead? So normally a restorative justice is far-sighted, so looks ahead, convinced that the person can change, and that the solution to be adopted will change that person and will allow the person to feel empowered and to be reinserted in society. So this actually justifies and motivates the reinsertion of the person, absolutely forgetting the stigma or the label of being imprisoned, and the person can also accept and say that she's happy to remain in the community and not to be expelled ejected by the community. So in a typical punitive system, the offender who has been condemned is not happy, but certainly not the victim, because the victim says, I don't care if the person is going to spend 20 years in a prison, and when he leaves the prison, he might even start committing crimes again. And the fact that you send someone to a prison doesn't really solve the problem. So once again, the satisfaction in this kind of system provides greater satisfaction, because the person can be actually listened, and certainly he has also the idea that he can repair and pay for his punishment, although it might require some time. For example, it could be enter into a college, to be, to do a detox treatment, and he is no longer ashamed of his of the act committed. He becomes responsible and he changes his lifestyle. And the victim at the same time is more appeased and satisfied by the system, because she felt that her case has been her case has been taken into account and listened, and there is a form of reparation because the person has been also repaid. It can be a compensation, which can be a material compensation or other forms, maybe, for example, a treatment, psychological treatment and accompaniment, may be able also to restore a relationship with the neighborhood. So also the victim is somehow compensated, and also society or community, because there is a social harmony which is being restored in society. So let's say it's a win-win solution. Money, culture, consequences for the community, the time frame, as well as the level of satisfactions are all elements of motivation, which should be used according to the different situations in the field of restorative justice. Now, of course, it is important to motivate. It's not only a question of imposing a system. You cannot impose the system of restorative justice if you don't motivate the population, because you have to actually be able to meet the needs of the community and also the open questions. So you cannot limit yourself to a legal framework which is being voted in Parliament, but also you have to prepare and all the human resources, and also to motivate. That is to win people on your side. This requires sort of encouraging policymakers, decision makers, the press. So you have to have a proper communication campaign, and the public opinion. All of this is very theoretical, but individually you'll have to understand how to better implement that in your own country and in your own culture. I would like to conclude with two more slides on the risks that you run in implementing restorative justice. The first risk is, I found a word which is similar to, it's boycott. Well, boycott is possible, and it is also possible Well, first of all, the police, because they often don't like that. They're happy to give him a bit of a blow, bring him back, put him in a prison, and now they have to change. So often they might oppose the system. And this is true not only for police, but also for staff in reformatories. They don't necessarily want to do this. They don't want to, they might lose their income because they are being replaced. I have a good friend who was at the head of an alternative reformatory in Latin America. He's not here with us, so there's no mention. What did he do? He eliminated the police officers in the reformatory. He said, no, 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 you're going to stay outside because you are in charge of security in the streets outside. I am in charge of my own security with civil staff. He had a lot of threats and horrible reactions from police officers because it was a good, a good bargain. They had a lot of traffic, drug, pornographic magazines, and much other, and substances. So they were controlling and they were earning a lot of money. So now that they were no longer able to be inside the reformatory, they lost all of these sort of profits, which certainly exceeded their monthly salaries. So if you introduce this kind of restorative system, you might disrupt those who are in favor of a punitive system, not only from a ideological point of view, because they also have some economic interests. So you can expect, or you should expect rather, some reaction. The same occurs for judges, lawyers, who are probably going to lose part of their earnings and their job. Because, when I was giving some of these training courses to judges, I noticed that they were quite hesitant. They said, but then we are no longer necessary. We're going to lose our job. I said, no, your job is going to change. Because they felt that the actual stakeholders and, let's say, protagonists were no longer those judges or prosecutors. And the third is community. So if the prevailing or the mainstream community mentality is that of punishment because of the educational system, the mentality of the society, of the political parties, leading political parties, the prevailing ideology is that of pure punishment. So in that case, you could expect a boycott. So probably boycott can be the mainstream. So one has to, in the motivation, before actually, one should foresee this kind of risk, because otherwise you might, and with an unsuccessful attempt. But there is another kind of risk, the risk which is intrinsic to the system, which is not as clear as the other. I want to show you the results of a survey on young people in Peru. The blue the blue line shows the number of people who have been in prison, behind the bars. That says this is a social educational measure which is simply behind the bars. The orange line are those young who are in conflict with law, who have been instead taken into charge in an open system. So they remain in their families, but for example, every week they have to attend a CIS center where they have a dialogue with a psychologist, a social worker, or a social counselor. And, they have certain actions. But this is not necessarily a restorative justice, simply that in the light of the infringement would not justify being imprisoned, but they are simply need to be followed up. The open system is interesting because, first of all, it's cheaper. For example, in Peru, we have 10 closed centers called reformatories, one for girls. You can imagine a country which is twice France. You have only one center for girls. So maybe they have to be necessarily be traveled to Lima. While open centers, there are about 30 centers. They are decentralized, so the young people do not necessarily need to travel to the capital city. And also families don't need to travel to visit their minors. But these are the two possible solutions. So what is the outcome? Well, I would say that, first of all, there is an increase in the number of cases, particularly those in the open system. It's four times more young entering into the open system. This can be justified because there are new and more open centers. So as far as, as more centers are open, young people can be included in these centers. But if you look at the blue line, also the blue line is on the high. It's increasing. Let's say from 2,000 per year, now it is about 4,000 per year. So this means that the younger ones are twice as dangerous compared to before, or 4 times more offenders. No, I don't think. It's a question of a change in the behavior. I would rather say that it is the number of young people which has increased, and not the number or the level of offense which has increased. It's the number of younger. So the fact that you open up and you set up open centers has not reduced the number of young in prison. So this means that the system is not effective, because even if you open new systems, open systems, you have more young people who are caught in the traditional system, both punitive or restorative, compared to the past. So there is something which is not well done, because if the open system is welcoming more young people, then one should imagine that there would be fewer in prisons, while instead there are more. So here there is a risk. And this is a very well-known system. That is, when you open a system, when you open up a system, be it a prison or other, the system is going to be filled. When you speak about prison for adults, or prison for adults means prison for adults which is rapidly filled. Because what happens with the young people? Some cases which originally were not dealt with in an open center or were not sent to a prison because there was a lack of place, they were sent to prison. Or some cases who were in an open center, one could say that it's full, so we send them to a prison, because each system wants to justify the existence and the operation. So just to show that they're working properly and that they are actually useful. So even in the best of all worlds, one will say, we are going to leave you here, we're not going to send you back home, because the judge also believes that he doesn't want to send you back home. He will say, no, you're going to stay here and you're simply going to be followed, and you're going to go to an open center or a closed center. So it's a risk for when you speak about alternative punishment, even for adults. So the fact of setting up a system of restorative justice does not necessarily imply that there's going to be a reduction or a decrease in the number of young people condemned. So this is something that you have to take into account. As when you have a system of restorative justice, one will have to make sure that the system is not going to include more cases compared to the past, and that it's not going to increase. So you have to be very aware, because otherwise it's almost like putting into the judicial washing machine more cases. How can you avoid that? Well, in certain countries, they were able to limit the population. Even some Nordic countries, like Finland, the Scandinavian countries, they said there is no penal problem, but rather a social one. So there is no criminal risk. What is his social situation? What is his level of education? But the social assistant will be sent to the house of the person, of the offender, so he will remain with his family. And this implies no longer the ministry falls under the competence of the Ministry of Justice, but rather the Ministry of Labor. So it's a social worker who will be in charge. But it's something you have to think about. When you speak about restorative justice, it's a justice which tries to identify restorative practices which are on a social point of view, education more than a form of punishment in a police station. And so we have to take into account this kind of risk, that cases run the risk of increasing rather than diminishing. The important question at this point is, are we ready to implement that in your country or not? If you feel tempted by that, but many say, yes, we would love that, but the mindset is not appropriate, so one has to first change. That completely something which doesn't concern myself, but you have to be convinced in the first place. And now the only thing I can do is thank you very much. And thank you for having given me the time to share. Could I maybe motivate and encourage to ask questions? I hope that you have been convinced by the fact that it could be actually implemented. I just wondered, anyone has a restorative justice in your countries? So if it does exist, or if it could be implemented, what would you imagine? I mean, do you believe that the risks that I have mentioned are the ones that you could also foresee, or are there other risks that would prevent and in introducing this system? Yeah, there is Albert. And also raising awareness of communities in the chat. It's something which should be done before actually implementing the system. And several have also agreed that that is an issue. Thank you very much. Bruno? Thank you for giving me the floor.
Effectivement, c'est la dernière question du diapo qui m'amène à...
The last question of the slide encourages me to make a little comment. And I was just wondering, are you really ready? I'm thinking about Togo, my country, to work with community. Because in our country, I also have some colleagues here. However, if you send someone to a court, it's like saying you killed me. It's almost as if you had killed, so you are a murderer. So we tend to solve the problem among us rather than resorting to a court. So if there is a restorative which is better organized and also by community, and we have resources for that, I think that would be the best. Now, the problem is that we don't really have this mindset. And so I certainly believe there is a lot of work to be done, starting from the community. If this may be, this is also including the various, involving the various partners. Thank you. Maybe also what we have said with Diana on the infringement of sexual crime. There is a lot of fights to recognize children who are object of physical violence, of physical abuse. So restorative justice doesn't necessarily mean mediation for all, doesn't necessarily mean negotiation for all. So Bruno was also saying there were some different possibilities. So you cannot really oppose this kind of justice with a form of restorative justice. because we have to protect the young. So for this kind of justice, you need a certain equality. And he has mentioned that in, we have to remind that you cannot sort of mix, pears and apples together. As we have said, there should be no mediation for those cases in which they are victims. So we should not go backwards. It's only when we have different forms of contract, of sanctions, which allow to be adapted. But we're not going to certainly negotiate a wedding or other. So restorative justice is not synonym of mediation. Just I wanted to clarify this aspect. Yes. And it's important to what you have said, and also Marie-Laure and Diana. First of all, the question of culture. In many cultures and many communities, the fact of actually committing a violation, an infringement, means that you basically place yourself outside the community. It's almost like a self-excluding yourself, or as Alda was saying, turning back to justice is excluding the person. This can be true, but in urban area, so it's a lack of shame, which leads to these offenses. Because often, if you don't know people, you basically kill, you rape, you rob, because you don't. It's different, sort of. An offense in a community where you know your neighbors compared to an offense in a society where you don't even know the name of your neighbor. So that also shows that there is a great difference between these two types of offense. And this also is true for the response, for the reaction. There are very interesting, let's say, elements and examples of positive restorative justice in prisons, where we have some groups. For example, robbers are grouped together in a group, and you also have a meeting with one of the victims. This is not done. It's not someone who has to do with your case, but maybe they are able to explain why they have robbed. And that also allows for to raise awareness, because the victim is no longer anonym. You actually see the victim and you understand the reaction of the victim, and you also understand that what you have done to the victim. In a community where everyone knows each other, there is shame, there is exclusion, social exclusion, etc. And also what Marie-Laure was mentioning about sexual violence and other forms of crime. Restorative justice is not negotiable. We have to be, this has to be really clear. You have to speak about solution. It's a problem solving. You have to find and reach a solution which can be acceptable for the victim, but also for the offender, which does not necessarily, you need to have a mediation, but often the mediation, but you cannot just simply tell, oh no, we're going to send you 20 years in prison. You maybe try to understand, why did you rape the victim? Maybe he needs a treatment, maybe he needs to learn about the rule of law, and the same for the victim. You cannot say, you've been raped, don't worry, he's in prison for 20 years, the offender, but what did you feel? How can we help you? Just maybe to restore and to go back to normal life. And the same for communities. There's no negotiator here. You're not just going to say, he's going to pay you a given amount, a compensation, and we forget about the problem. No, instead, we're going to try to find the solution and not a negotiation. There's no negotiation. So once again, it's not simply identifying a compromise. A compromise solution is not the midway. Between 50 and 100, the solution is not 75. The solution is a decision which has to be jointly accepted. And the question of mediation is one of the possible ways and means, but not the only one. One cannot believe that always the offender and the victim are always going to meet and talk. This can be done only if they accept to do that, but it's not necessarily the only possible solution. So there is a lack of resources and of a mindset. There is actually a persistence. The mediation is actually for minor crimes. So we're speaking about a justice which is exclusive among the youth. So how can you make sure that the restorative justice does not exclude the infringement? So I understand the first part of the question, that is a lack of resources and of mindset. Yes, I understand. This is exactly what also has been the outcome of the survey. Most of the Latin American countries says, yes, the system exists, but the mindset or the mainstream mindset is against. And so how can we change that? How can we change this mindset? We continue to form our lawyers and judges, hoping to promote prevention. This is a theory which dates back to the 19th century, according to which if there is a punishment and everyone is aware of that punishment, it prevents a crime. But this has never been true, has never been confirmed, because even if you think that you have going to be punished, a rapist is going to rape. He's not going to think about the punishment he is going to incur in. So he's not going to avoid robbing or raping because he's thinking at the punishment. No, there is no direct link. Unfortunately, this theory has not been confirmed, but many believe it is possible. Now, I'm saying about the difference of crimes. Yes, I better understand now. Yes, of course, in certain crimes, for others you use restorative justice and for others no. Well, of course, when you say exclusions, you sometimes could make actually a distinction between minor crimes or given crimes or offenses. For certain crimes, you believe that you can actually provide a punishment. Those for which you believe that could not provide a punishment should go back to the punitive justice. No, I don't think it's a good idea. I believe that also when you speak about those damages which cannot be compensated should not necessarily be treated by a punitive justice. And you cannot limit restorative justice to minor offenses, because it's not necessarily a good way of handling different levels of crimes. I would like to, let's say, follow what Marie-Laure was saying. The restorative justice does not exclude the fact that it should be presented in a proper way. So in the case of restorative justice, you cannot impose prison, or sentence, which involves going behind the bars, particularly when it is the case of a minor. But you always have to think at the future. You have to take into account all of the elements, and you have to take into account the victim and not only the offender. What is important is that you have to restore harmony and a peace in the community. I think it is always feasible. But when you do restorative justice, you can also condemn. You can condemn, and you can even condemn to prison if you believe that prison is the best way of sort of reinserting the person in society and community, and maybe actually I don't find that every crime can be repaired. Thank you. If we want to make sure that this system, the restorative justice, involves reinsertion into society, is what is defined as post-institutional justice. So if you do not make sure that there is a follow-up and supporting and accompanying these initiatives with social reinsertion through practicing sport, culture, various activities,
representa para las comunidades y los victimarios todo un reto.
So that represents otherwise a challenge for communities. So you have to actually, we have experiences and cases of post-institutional accompaniment, which do produce a result. But of course, we would like to understand if this is done. It's not only a question of reaching pardon, conciliation, and compensation. But if you don't provide accompaniment, if you don't provide a follow-up for both the victim and the offender through a systemic system, this has to be done over time and through very concrete actions and programs. I fully agree with what you have said. We are speaking about restorative practices which are not limited in simply doing a very specific problem solving, but this implies also social policies which and also associations which can provide this kind of contribution. I'm thinking about Peru. There is nothing of this kind. There is even no kind of policy within the because there's no clear idea of what should be done. So also what Angelica was saying. So restorative justice doesn't necessarily end when the punishment, so to speak, is over, but you have to make sure that you have a follow-up in order that you don't, there is no repetition of that crime. So this is part of the social policies, not only justice or judicial norms. That will depend very much on the setting which can exist in a given country. You always have to reflect and understand why. What is the goal of justice? Money? Even for judges and lawyers, justice is simply enforcing the law. But if you don't believe that in putting people behind the bars cannot encourage and produce a change in their behavior, then one should start questioning the legal system. So in order for a person to change, and if you don't have the means to do that, you have to review and amend the system. It's almost like saying, you're not ill, we send you to a hospital, but where there is no doctor, there are no drugs, it will never be useful. So, of course, for a health system, it will not be useful, but it's not maybe necessarily true in the case of a legal system. So we have to absolutely... So there are things which are not necessarily normal. Even if the society is encouraged to, a punitive one.
dans l'entourage, les gens veulent la
I
main
would
forte.
say that people like to have an iron fist.
Mais
We have to close them behind the bars.
qu'ils connaissent,
But this is true up
dans cette situation, et
as long as it's not a member of their family which ends into a prison. At that point, they become aware and they understand that this is not the way it should be done. So the contact with the system, with actually this punitive system, is important. But this system normally tends to cover up reality, and it's not easy. It's not easy to have a contact with. So they try to protect themselves.
Pour faire changer le système punitif, je crois qu'il
And to
faut
change that,
les portes des prisons pour que rentre
you have to open the doors of the prison so that you allow the public to see exactly what happens, and also
un premier pas à faire qui peut ouvrir un peu
that would be
la
an initial step. That would be also, I would say, mind-breaking and eye-opening, and it certainly would lead to a more dignified system, legal system, which certainly corresponds better to the restorative justice. Thank you really very much. I think we have really worked well. So we're going to have the fourth session on restorative justice. We're going to be Diana from Colombia, who is going to present in concrete terms how to implement restorative justice with minors in conflict with the law. So we are now presented the theory. So with Diana and her presentation, we will understand to what it actually corresponds. So while we are waiting for this session, next week we will meet on Tuesday 13th at always 4 p.m. Those are children victims of sexual violence, so the accompaniment which is provided. I want to wish you a nice end of the week and see you at the following. Thank you, and thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all of you.